Hey everyone, and welcome back to this Blender Basics course. So we've looked at the 3D viewport and interface. Now we're gonna get started on sort of understanding the modeling principles and some of the tools that you can use. So if we jump onto our Blender screen, we can see we've got this default cube, we've got this camera and light setup. And I'm going to show you sort of the modeling tools that you can get just within the cube, and we'll just go through and run through what everything does. So to start off with, we can see that we've got this basic move, scale and rotate. Now, if you want to change the shape of something, you can't do it with these simple tools. You need to do something else. And within Blender, there's something called edit mode. Now, I can click this cube and press tab, and that will take me into edit mode, and you can instantly see we've got all these different tools. But obviously, if you don't want to use shortcuts and you just want to click, if we look at here, we have object mode, and there's loads of different tools, so edit mode, sculpt mode, vertex, weight paint, texture paint. We'll get into all of that when it's needed. So I'm going to click edit mode, and it will take me into the same option. Now, one thing to bear in mind is if you have multiple objects and you want to go into edit mode for one object, you need to select that object that you want to go into edit mode in. If you select a different one, it will go into that one. So just be mindful, if you can't get it on that model, it's probably because you haven't selected it beforehand. So if we look, we're in edit mode, we've got this cube selected. We have all the basic principles that we had before, but we've got these ones at the bottom. So the way that most people model in Blender is quite destructive. I mean, in the sense that you can't go back, you can't change stuff without pretty much redoing what you do. There are ways that you can do it, which we'll get into. For example, for the model that we're going to use for our shot, I'll be using some sort of non-destructive modeling techniques. But for the most part in Blender, we're going to be using these tools, which are destructive, unfortunately. So just to go over some of the ones that we have extrude, inset, bevel, loop cut, knife, poly build, spin, randomize, edge slide, shrink fatten, shear, and rip. And these will all have very specific functions. They'll even have drop downs. Now, some of these may look very confusing. Even to me, some of them are a little bit confusing. But for the most part, you're going to be sticking with the ones that it already gives you. So I'm just going to go through, explain each one, and hopefully you'll be able to understand what each one does, and sort of, so if you want a cup, you can sort of visualize what you need to do to make it sort of inset into the bottom and stuff like that. So to start off with, extrude. If I just press extrude, you'll see we just get another cube. And obviously, say if we want to make this block taller, that's not what we want to do. So I'm going to press Control or Command on the Mac, Z to undo. Again, we've got our little highlight, what I'm pressing at the bottom. We can see we've got this whole thing selected, or for some reason we've got this edge selection. So if I click this edge, it's only extruding. Now extruding is pulling part of the object mesh outwards in a direction that you want. Now, there's obviously vertex, edge, or face. Now, if you've watched a terminology video, you'll understand what some of these terms are. Well, essentially, they're part of an object's mesh. And I want to select this face, and I want to make it bigger. So this is a face because it has 4 edges, so it's essentially a polygon. Now, if you look at the top left, next to edit mode, we have these sort of selections. And if we hover over them, we'll see we have vertex select, we have edge select, and we also have face select. And there is a shortcut, so you can just press 1, 2, or 3, and that will go through them. Now, we want face. So you see I'm on face select here. So if I want to select the whole face and extrude it, I can just extrude now, and now I've got 2 parts of an object. So say, for example, I want to manipulate this middle part of the mesh to sort of make it bigger than everything else. I can go into edge mode because we can see there's 2 lines here and there's also 2 at the back. And by clicking them with left click and shift clicking to add multiple edges to a selection, we can select all of them. Another shortcut would be Alt Select, and that will select a loop of an object. And with that, we can then press Scale. And you can see, because we're scaling the middle part and it's all one mesh, we can get a different object sort of shape. So there we can see we've got sort of a cool shape. So that's extrude. It's essentially pulling part of a mesh outwards. And we can do it on all axes, so we could grab this face, extrude, and extrude it there. We could extrude this inwards by pressing Z and pulling it down. So now we've pulled it inwards. So there's lots of different functions, and the extrude is probably one of the most popular ones. Again, there's shortcuts for it. So extrude is also E on the keyboard, so you can press E. And there you go. Again, if you don't want to actually use it, you can just press Escape and it will cancel that extrusion. One thing to keep in mind when modeling is sometimes you'll press extrude, click, and then extrude again. And you'll actually create 2 extrudes. So if I pull this down, you'll see it's still there, and that's because you've extruded twice. So if you ever come across that problem, it's probably because you've extruded multiple times. Inset is quite a common tool, especially for cups. I keep giving a cup as an example. So a cup has sort of that tallness, and then it goes in, and then it goes down on itself. So that's a good way to visualize it, because inset, so I have face select and I'm going to inset. It sort of contracts the face into itself and creates a smaller face inside. So you may be wondering, how do you get that deepness of a cup if you've just inset it? And it's as simple as just going back to that extrude. Now that you've got that inset face, I'm just pulling it down. So immediately we can see we've got a deeper face inside now. And a thing I mentioned in the terminology video is that you always start off with a shape that is closest to the object that you're trying to model. So obviously we have a cube here, but a cup is normally cylinder. So you do this whole process, but with a cylinder. Inset you can pretty much do on all faces, but there are also other options. So say we click shift click and we select multiple faces and we inset. You can see here that it's inset both of them. So they're sort of connected. However, you'll see that there's like this sort of dialog box at the bottom left. And this happens for pretty much all processes in Blender. It essentially gives you more options than the ones that you've just done. So if we click this arrow, we can see we have even more options. So we have individual or outset, select outset. And these are quite interesting. So if we select individual, we can see it actually separates everything, which is quite useful. Say if you're extruding multiple things on the same sort of plane or face, but you want different holes, this is basically the way that you do it. And now we can see if we go back up to extrude and we extrude them in, we've got separate holes. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. If you're ever manipulating something and you're not sure how to get a specific option, if you look at the bottom left, that may be a way to get it. We've got a third one, which is called bevel. And there is an actual modifier for this, but the way I define modifiers is that it's as an object as a whole. So modifiers apply the whole thing to the whole object, whereas this type of modeling only affects parts that you actually want it to affect. So bevel essentially is, if you know furniture, it's a chamfer on the edge of a model. So I'm going to show that by pressing edge select or number 2, and I'm going to alt click to get that loop, and I'm going to pull this down. And now you can see here we've got sort of a chamfered edge, or a curved, well, a sort of curved edge. And this is quite useful because I always mention that in 3D you're trying to replicate real life. Nothing at all is completely at a 90-degree angle. So pretty much everything that you model should have a bevel or chamfer of some kind. So I'd always use the bevel tool, and it comes in quite handy for modeling, which I'll show when we get to modeling something quite complex. As well as the bevel tool, you also get these different functions as well. So you could bevel the vertices instead, or the edge. You can select different width types, sort of like that, even how many segments, and lots of different things. Even sort of the shape of it, you could have it bevel inwards if you really wanted to. So that's the bevel tool. Now there is a modifier, but I'm going to explain the bevel modifier when we get to the modifier section. So I'm going to move on to loop cut now. And loop cut essentially adds geometry to a mesh. So obviously the more geometry you have, the slower your computer is going to run, because your computer has to calculate all of that information. However, having geometry is necessary in some aspects. So we can see a loop cut, it cuts a mesh loop and slides it. Now that sounds quite complicated, but essentially it's just adding in more mesh that you can select. So for example, if you wanted to pull just this middle part outwards, you could add in this loop, and then you could select this face, again shift and left click, and you could say grab it and pull it outwards. Now without having that extra mesh there, you wouldn't be able to achieve that look because there's nothing to grab. If I just select that one, it pulls out a different way. So it is needed sometimes to add loop cuts in, but obviously the more geometry you have, the slower your computer will run, and also the more complex it would be to fix something if it goes wrong or something like that. But I'm going to keep this loop cut in, and I'm also going to show you that it works on multiple aspects as well. So you could add in one there. And as well as this, you'll see we have another sort of dialog box, and this will allow you to create more loops if you really wanted to. As well as this, you can also manipulate these loops. So if you wanted it to be upwards, you can just double tap G and it will move it within the mesh, which is quite useful. So moving on, we have the knife tool, and this is a quite destructive method. It's normally used very rarely, but sometimes it comes in quite handy. And essentially, it allows you to cut into a mesh. So I've cut a triangle there and I'm going to hit enter. So it allows you to cut parts into a mesh. So for example, I could click face and then maybe extrude it inwards. And now we see we have sort of a triangle in the shape. Now obviously, if we wanted to smooth this object, it would have to calculate all of these edges, which could be quite difficult. So you have to bear in mind with your geometry that everything flows very nicely. I explained that when you're trying to unwrap an object, you have to cut everything open so that it folds out nicely. So for example, a cube, it will fold out into a cross. Now you have to try and imagine how this would now fold out if you have a random triangle. So you have to keep your mesh tidy, and it will just come with practice and just watching loads of different videos, looking at different artists, how they work, and you'll sort of get a grasp of how you should be modeling sort of complex stuff like this. I'm just going to show you that you can also do this in all them different views that I was talking about. So you can go side view, and you can cut side like that, and it will go just on the mesh like that. So the next one is polybuild, and this essentially allows you to manipulate the vertices in your mesh without having to go into the move tool. So this is quite handy, but again, I explained that moving stuff or placing stuff in 3D is a little bit tricky because obviously you have that depth, you don't really understand where you're really placing it. So I'd always use the axis still, so you may as well just use the move tool, just because it makes it a little bit more simple and easier to work with than just moving it around, even though you could press this polybuild and grab it and use the same thing. But I'd still just use the move tool just so it brings in the same principles of using the axis to move your objects. The spin tool is quite an interesting one with the way it works. So for example, I'm going to select this face with 3 or this face up here. And we can see we've got this sort of option here. So if I click this, it's creating a curve and it goes full 360. However, what if you wanted it to go this way? And that's where another sort of selection of buttons come in. So up here we have X, Y, Z. And we can see when we manipulate that, it actually changes. So I'm going to select this one and we can see it's changing there. And that's because a spin tool is based on the cursor that you have. So we can see if we go into front view or side view, this cursor is the middle point of this spin. So if you move the cursor and then go back onto spin, it's actually connected around it. You can see here it's perfectly around this cursor. So the spin tool works off the cursor. So if I wanted to now spin it, we can see it's going around that cursor. And it's just a matter of finding the right spot for your spin. So I'm just gonna, there we go, that looks a little bit more normal. So that could be maybe useful if you wanted to make a handle. There are many ways to make a handles, but essentially this is sort of a principle that you may use. As well as this, you have that dialog box and you can limit the amount of geometry you have or increase it depending on what you're trying to achieve. And yeah, the spin tool is quite handy in some circumstances. Obviously, for every model, you're not going to use every modeling tool. It's only for specific things, and you'll be surprised with what works and what doesn't for some objects. So maybe you think you knew how to model this, but it actually ended up being something else. So you've always got to keep an open mind on how to model something. For example, although there's a spin tool, there's an option where you can go to extrude. And obviously you could extrude it like this, but you can also press Control and right click. And that will essentially do the same thing. So there we see we have sort of a handle shape, even though it's way too big. It works the same way. And because we were in that side view, so it turns that view into a 2D perspective, it hasn't moved, so it's all on a straight line, which we can see. If we were to do it like, if I was to undo this and then do it in just a normal view, we could see it starts to differentiate sort of the depth. So always do stuff like this in a perspective view, such as the front or side or back, something that limits the depth of an image. So we have another one, which is randomize, and this one is quite interesting. So if we select everything, so I'm going to hit A and that will select all, and we just right click this, we can see if there's randomize or smooth. So I'm going to press smooth and we can see everything's sort of being rounded off. So we had some sharp edges here. Now this is just smoothing everything off. And now you may think, oh, this is sort of how you get smooth objects. However, this is obviously destructive. And I mentioned before that there's some modifiers that do the same jobs as this, which aren't destructive. However, they apply to the whole object. Now, obviously, this is applying to the whole object, but it's destructive. So you would want to use a modifier in this case. So I'm just going to quickly show you a modifier. So this is the modifier tab with this wrench. And that was smoothing everything out. So this modifier basically does the exact same thing, but obviously you can change it and keep that shape. So we'll be going into modifiers, so don't worry why it's going into sort of a cylinder, even though it's a square. I will explain that when we get to it. So I'm just going to delete that and just go into the next one. So underneath that, there was randomize as well. So where that one's smoothed, this one will sort of randomize. And this one can actually be quite useful if you're trying to model an object which is very imperfect, such as a rock maybe. This could be quite a good way to get that random shape that you're actually after. Now, this one is called edge slide, and you'll be probably doing this a lot when you're manipulating your meshes. So edge slide is essentially moving an edge within a mesh. So where we were actually moving part of a mesh, this edge slide actually moves within the within the mesh itself. And this can really help with sort of the flow of geometry, where you want things to be smooth and stuff like that. But that is quite complicated, but we will be covering it when we get to it, and you'll understand it when it's applied with an actual purpose. This one is called shrink fatten, and this is essentially the same thing as what you can do with other ones, but essentially it's just scaling an object or fattening it. But like I said, you could use the move tool and then also the scale tool to get the exact same result, and obviously you have more control with this. So obviously it's the same, it's a different method, but it's the same principle. We also have shear, and this again is sort of the same principle of what we have already. This one rotates based on which button you press, but again, you could just, let me just undo that, rotate, and you could just rotate it if you really wanted to. Now, this final one is a rip tool, and this is quite interesting because there isn't really another button for this. So say you model something and then you wanted to create an opening or something, you could actually rip that entire mesh off. And this is quite interesting. Obviously, it would require a specific sort of purpose for it, but it can be quite useful. So we can rip all these meshes apart, which can be quite useful. We can see it's ripped the mesh. And now that's pretty much it for the modeling tools. Now, Blender is open source, and that means that you can download lots of different add-ons. So for example, I can go into Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and you'll see we have loads of these different things. And this essentially means that people may make different tools for like specific purposes, and they will appear here. Now, because Blender is open source, anyone can edit the code. And that means that people can create their own custom editors or modeling tools, and then you can download them and then install them into your software to use. So ones I've seen is maybe like cable generators, so people model cables and it makes it really simple. Making circles within squares. There's lots of different options, and it's all about being aware and knowing what other people are doing, and just keeping an open mind about stuff that is out there, really. Now, in the next episode of this course, we're going to be covering a complex model, and it's going to be the start of a lipstick shot that we're hopefully going to achieve. So I'll be covering all these tools within that model, as well as some modifier tools, but we will also cover modifiers as a separate course as well. So I'll see you in the next one.